so grateful. Thank you, Nick, for agreeing to present today.
It's a pleasure.
And it looks like a fabulous article on this concept of decolonizing methods, but also looking at new methods that I hadn't ever heard about. So duoethnography and Métissage, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yeah, so let's see how the conversation goes. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen.
Yes,
Are you seeing? Is it coming
yeah,
through? Okay, great. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to present. I really chose a journal article because of my own biased views around autoethnography, which I think are relevant. So I've always been quite critical of autoethnography and have heard critiques around it being navel gazing and all that the like. So I thought, let me challenge myself. But also I am supervising quite an accomplished master's student this year who's doing an autoethnographic study of her COVID journey. So I am supervising an autoethnographic study, and so I wanted to delve more deeply into this area. So the article really just looks at, there's 4 moves that I'm going to focus on. Firstly, what duoethnography and metissage are, and then their similarities and differences, and then how they contribute or how they are proclaimed to be decolonizing research methodologies. And then there's a 4 practices framework for how we can evaluate whether a methodology is decolonizing. And then maybe just an open invitation for us to explore, can we see ourselves doing this? Maybe you have done it. Are there, you're wondering,
When I read that,
can I do?
It feels familiar.
So yeah, please feel free to interrupt as we go along, but I will end off with like an open invitation for us to brainstorm possible projects or to reflect on the ways in which we have integrated these practices into our existing work. I don't think any of the principles or constructs have been new to qualitative researchers, but the level of self-exposure might be novel, but certainly is for me. So just an introduction around what duoethnography is. It's really a collaborative research methodology where 2 or more researchers juxtapose their life histories through a dialogic narrative. And the aim is to provide, not just to self-explore, but to provide multiple understandings of a social phenomenon. And importantly, the process of duoethnography is meant to be transformative for the researchers. So you're meant to change as a person. And typical social phenomena that are studied under this methodology pertain to gender, identity, curriculum. And as we'll see with both duoethnography and metissage, they're grounded in curriculum theory. But also there's examples of mentorship in academia where we see this methodology used. And then in contrast, well, not in contrast, metissage is an approach where autobiographical texts are weaved with local cultural knowledge, dialects and traditions, and it became popularized as a methodology by post-colonial and post-structural curriculum scholars. So just to go back to the history of duoethnography, as its name implies, it's rooted in ethnography and autoethnography, as well as critical self-study, and involves questions around culture and researchers from different cultural backgrounds, and began as a methodology to challenge a meta-narrative which results from solitary writing. And here's a definition by Sawyer and Norris, 2 of the key proponents of duoethnography, that really 2 or more researchers engage in a dialogue on their disparate histories on a given phenomenon, and they interrogate and reconceptualize existing beliefs through a conversation, typically written in a play script format.
That was interesting to me, because I wasn't quite sure if I could envision what that would look like.
Yes.
I mean, I absolutely identify with the principles here and the dialogue, but the play script format, that's an interesting output.
Yes.
Maybe a data.
Yes.
A form of data.
Yeah.
Collection.
Yeah, I did look at some examples, and it does, parts of the article look like a script, a conversation between 2 people. And I'm seeing more and more, for example, at SASA and other conferences, you see invitations to present not just posters or paper presentations, but poetry or creative pieces. I've never ventured into that terrain. Yeah, and I'd never attend those, but I suppose there is this attempt to broaden academia.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Sampe conferences or the campfire stories, which probably fits that.
Yes.
And then what they had this year was a couple of those campfires were conversations between two academics around a particular project.
Yeah.
So that would probably fit that narrative.
Very much rooted in narrative and the drama and stories and narratives.
Reminds me of this Chip. Some of those conferences as well are so out there in terms of what people are presenting and researching.
I want to do say an interpretive job.
Literally, they like had someone doing like slam poetry, like which is
for me it makes it so much more fun because it also enables you to connect with knowledge in a much different format.
Well, it forces
very traditional.
It forces you to, like you said, not just have like your sort of blinkered approach to how it should be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly the safety of presenting in formalized ways. There is safety in that for me.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So as I said, pioneered by Norris and Sawyer, who are Canadian and USA curriculum theorists, and began this explicitly. I don't think they're certainly not the first to examine self, but certainly the first to start writing about geoethnography. And so the first publication in 2004 by Sawyer and Norris around null and hidden curricula in relation to sexual orientation. So the ways in which we learn about sexuality, not through the explicit curriculum, but through other ways of being in educational spaces. So, and we'll recognize these principles that they claimed they could no longer bracket or claim to bracket themselves or eliminate their subjective presence in research. And they could no longer claim that their participants' views belonged only to their participants, despite engaging in measures of trustworthiness that we're all familiar with. So even though we might triangulate or be reflexive or use member checking, the way in which we present our participants' views is still heavily influenced by the researcher. So they're recognized for highlighting the connection between philosophical curriculum theory and geoethnographic methodologies, and drawing back attention to Curere, which was written by Pinar in 1975, which is a combination of autobiography and curriculum studies. And so Curere is understanding the role that culture and subcultures have on the ways researchers make meaning or interpret any process of knowledge construction.
Very interesting that they've focused so specifically on curriculum.
Yes.
Because I think, as we'll talk a bit later, that's certainly been my experience of where this kind of approach has come out is in scholarship of teaching and learning studies and interrogating your own educational practice. And kind of linking to that participant action research kind of research as well, where you're studying practices in your own field.
Well, if you think about the notion of curriculum, you know, what is your life story? We think about curriculum vitae, but for work purposes. But it goes beyond that, about what's your life history, what's your life trajectory. And curriculum in schooling context, from a narrow perspective, is about what's in the textbook or what's taught. But as we know, that's never the curriculum. So we distinguish between what's at the declared and the enacted curriculum and the hidden.
Exactly. And how do we learn those? And how do they become overt and explicit?
So just I wanted to look at some examples of geoethnography, and so there is a book in 2012 by Norris et al. So I looked at some of the chapters. So chapter 2, as we've been speaking, was about hidden curriculum of schooling. So similar to their pioneering publication around how do you learn about sexuality in educational contexts. Chapter 3 pertains to post-colonial education, and chapter 6, power and privilege in relation to race relations. And then a more recent publication, here we see a piece of work by 4 Black women scholars doing a duo, or I don't know what that would be, a quadro ethnographic study of multi multi quadro. I think we'll coin it. Let's
So let's just add more
Simon
terms
has a PhD.
yes,
to qualitative.
yes. The merging of words, and then you create your own niche. So, so yeah, we see this mentoring in academia very relevant, something I'm particularly interested in. And then a third example, critical duoethnography around social justice research. So for educators doing social justice research projects, the use of duoethnography to examine structures of power. So those are some examples of duoethnography. Then some of the tenets, it avoids a prescriptive approach. Individual voices are to be made explicit, and importantly, there should be awareness of power differentials if you're working with a co-researcher, and that you should be seeking similarities and differences, but recognizing that differences are strengths. Dialogic practices at the heart, and as we've already seen, the final text, not only, but there is a script, kind of play script format that is integrated into the writing of the academic pieces I've seen. And again, to reiterate that the shift in perspective is vital. And so here's a really powerful quote that the participants, in other words, the researchers, shattering and subsequent reformation of meaning and reconceptualization is what's needed. The perspective, it is shattering your formation of meaning.
Which I think is so powerful, because actually it's only through this deep reflective work that you get to that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sure.
And that perspective of the other provides a foundation for a dynamic, reconstructed perception of self. Yeah, they do summarize 9 different tenets of duoethnography. The one that I just wanted to pull out was around this third or negotiated or ethical space that comes up throughout the paper. Some of the limitations, none of them seemed unique to duoethnography for me. They write about how they're similar to any qualitative methodology. I personally don't think generalizability is a limitation of qualitative research, because it's not intended to be generalizable. So I don't know how it can be a limitation.
It's up as like a limitation, and you're like, but that's the point. Exactly. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be context specific.
Exactly.
To be.
Yeah. Somehow people feel the need to push it in.
Yes. Got nothing else to say for limitations. Just add generalization as a problem. But so potential bias, subjectivity, but again, that's also can be seen as a strength. Power dynamics, if these aren't addressed. So if I have seen some duoethnographic studies of supervisor and student, if those aren't managed, then the power dynamics could be a limitation. And then many of duoethnographic work seems to be done by researchers, obviously, but they're not necessarily people who are in positions here of underrepresentation or oppressed individuals. And then the process, as we see, the strong leaning to narrative or storytelling. But again, it's not just to recant stories, but to restory. You can use artifacts such as photographs, yearbooks, recollections of influential books and movies. In other words, the influences of culture on your duoethnography are important.
It's really interesting as well to pull in objects.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's,
and it ties in so nicely with that insider outsider researcher idea.
definitely. Yeah, I want to speak a bit more about that later, I think, because that's really key.
Yeah. So we'll see this in Metissage as well, and I must admit I'm still not sure what the difference is, and maybe it doesn't matter. You can maybe frame it in the way that works for your study, I guess.
I got the impression that the Metissage is more to do with then interrogating your own story in relation to communities, whereas the duoethnography is more about your own practice and understanding of that.
Like two researchers having a conversation.
Yes.
Because I was wondering about this with
you know, like you could have two people having the conversation, and then it's like who's doing the analysis? Like, is it a third person, or when it's two researchers doing the conversation and doing the analysis, it's like they're very involved in it.
Yes.
But if you like, I'm now going to analyze an interview between a nurse and a patient. You know, like it's not a duoethnography.
No.
No.
But I'm also thinking about how, you know, some people are automatically excluded from being a voice in a duoethnography because they're not researchers.
Yeah.
So they can't be involved in that discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the Metissage is more
Yes.
about researchers then pulling in and including community members.
Yes. Yeah. Certainly. The Metissage had more leanings towards decolonialization or indigenous communities than so duoethnography, I don't think, is implicitly decolonial. But yeah, interesting to look at the history of the term metissage. Comes the Latin word mixtus or mixing, the Greek homonym metis, and interestingly, I didn't know this, Metis was Zeus's wife who had skills and powers of transformation. So this is the historical roots of metissage. And in Canadian context, where much of this work comes from, métis became a racial category involving mixing or half-breed and had negative connotations. So I imagine today an attempt to transform those negative connotations in Canadian context and globally. So metissage, if you're using this methodology, it carries the ability to transform, mix, and undo logic, and arose from also narrative storytelling, life writing traditions, and symbolically involves braiding or the art of weaving, and can now be used, is now being used as a research methodology by scholars across disciplines to challenge the dominance of Western knowledge systems.
I think it's really amazing if it can be worked and done properly.
Yes.
Because you're then weaving voices
Yes.
and giving credence to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So certainly it does. Very empowering. Yeah.
And they talked about thematic braiding.
Yes.
Quite a nice
Yes.
term.
Yes. Something to use in your next paper.
Yes, more terms and bigger.
So some examples of metissage here, a 2020 publication, these authors, University of Victoria, using metissage to contribute to conversations about race, decolonization, unsettling research, and shifting the traditional lens of language and literacy research and practice. It's also been used by Canadian environmental educators who incorporate Western and Indigenous knowledge and philosophy into their ecological identities and pedagogical praxis. And again, it made me think about its potential in South African context or in climate change research, the importance of involving local communities in understanding environment and sustainability. And then there is a book, who knew, from 2009, a whole book on literary metissage that introduces literary metissage. So I haven't read it, but I'm not sure about the extent to which it's grounded in traditional research methodologies. But they proclaim it as a way to research, teach, and live ethically. So a group of Canadian scholars who trace their mixed and multiple identities while interrogating possibilities of identity. So some of the tenets, it also follows the concept that we were introduced to with duoethnography around curere, so involving autobiographical texts and engaging in complex conversations with yourself and others. It should capture discussions and exchanges outside of traditional curriculum discourses, as we've already been speaking. And it goes beyond traditional binary and racial differences that essentialize identities. And again, there's reference to this third space where different knowledges and perspectives can come together, and the reference to thematic braiding. The limitations also linked to being a qualitative methodology. So some of the limitations include scope for topic and question type. Again, generalizability comes up, bias in narratives, and the choice of artifacts. Obviously, the researchers and the community have the power to choose which artifacts to enter into the dialogue. Subjectivity, again, is that a limitation? And then the challenges that are associated with weaving stories and ideas from multiple systems. And I can just imagine that it must seem quite messy. At some stage, you must feel like you are.
It made me think of bricolage as well.
Yes.
Initially, I looked at this, and when I started reading
Yes.
the front bit about
Yes.
Métissage, I was like, oh, this is
Yeah.
like bricolage.
Yeah.
And then I realized that they're different.
Yeah.
But again, it's borrowing from multiple perspectives and
Mm.
voices and like angles
Yeah.
that it can become, I'd imagine that it becomes difficult from a methodological point of view to weave that all together
Yeah.
in a sort of coherent way. And I
Yeah.
think, like you said, Jenny, I think if done well, it can be very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if done sort of quite superficially,
Yes.
I think it can become quite complex.
And ethically as well, I guess there's a real need to make sure that what you're capturing and reporting does fully capture what the participants intended. So there should probably be a lot of back and forth in terms of trustworthiness mechanisms.
Very time consuming, I imagine.
Yeah, this
It's
is
done
very
today.
slow,
Yes.
definitely. Very slow.
A lot of reflexive practice
Yes.
amongst everyone, just
Yeah.
checking in sort of the whole time with
Yeah.
yourself and with others in terms of,
Mm.
is this the same, do we all have the same idea in terms of where this is going?
Absolutely, yeah.
Doesn't fit well with key performance targets in organizations. How many papers have you published for promote? I mean, it's like,
But the slow research, I think, is always hard to convince like higher powers in terms of.
It is, but it's infinitely more meaningful
Yeah.
than this sort of wham
Yes.
bam churn out
Yeah.
any rubbish.
Yeah. So again, the process that's centralized is around braiding. That image on the cover of that book is really, the what is that, like a mat weaving? Yeah. So this complex and iterative process, we spoke about time-consuming writing, braiding, rewriting, critical dialogue, reflection, intention, multiple exchanges and conversations between researchers and participants to discover relationality. And again, may include artifacts. And it would be interesting for us to think about which artifacts we might want to include. I've done some research with, I've got participants to introduce photographs into research, which has been amazing in terms of depth of what is discussed.
Photos they had already, or
both?
Not
So existing photographs, and then to take photographs as part of a phenomenon. And the interviews that arise from that are really just so much more emotional and meaningful.
Thinking of Sancho's methods as well with drawings and getting your adolescents to draw and then talk about drawings. Yeah, so that might fit in here as well, I guess.
Yeah, it reminded me of that, and I was very frustrated thinking when I was reading and thinking, would I ever use this? Because the drawings are very frustrating. Unlike,
How do you analyze?
Yes, where do you start? Because I was just thinking with this, where does data collection start? Where does it end? Where does analysis begin? Where does it end? So it's a bit messy and very like messy.
It's been challenging actually to know what to do and how to advise people with those drawings, because when you start looking in the literature, there isn't really methodological guidance on what to do then with drawings, other than
If it would be worth speaking to, there's a Tina's busy supervising someone, a PhD student from UCT, and she's using body mapping.
Yeah, that's quite well established.
Is it?
Yeah.
Would you look at it similarly in terms of how you analyze drawings versus?
I think I've mentioned that as a possible avenue for looking into what people do with it.
Have you looked into arts therapy? Because I found a paper like with palliative communication with children, where they had the children draw pictures and then they're looking at features of the pictures. And I think it's in arts therapy that you might have like features of the pictures.
Yeah, so I came across that, but it's for all the papers that I've read, it's mostly with the younger kids, under 7 going down. where their drawings are not that good. Whereas with my group, they were older. I think the youngest one was 13 to 17. So it's very clear for them the drawing is easy. Like the kids were right in the years.
But like even things like the choice of colors, or like the positioning of like things within the space or whatever. I think that there are some, I don't know, like I haven't about it in any detail, but I think that in arts therapy they have some of those kinds of like, things you can interpret from features.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, might be good.
Yeah.
It also just strikes me how it's based in history this is.
Yes.
My mom is a historian.
Yes.
Source-based material
Yes.
is huge.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it's funny how our fields are intermingling now.
Absolutely.
That, the source base is a very powerful way of recalling history. And that's basically what we do,
Yes. Yes.
but perhaps in present day.
Yes.
Mm,
Yeah.
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 sure. Really interesting.
Yeah. There's definitely links to, as you say, history, storytelling, historical man and woman, and ways in which they were being.
And the use of source
Yes.
material.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Diaries,
Yeah.
photographs.
Yeah.
Mhm. I was thinking also of, I don't know if anybody here attended that lecture with Loretta Baldassar talking about migrant connections. So her field, she's Australian and she does work with Maria.
Mm.
So she was brought out as a scholar at GradSat. And so she's looking at how people build connections when you've got families split through migration. And she was drawing on old letters that people had written to inform her analysis. Fascinating, really interesting. Yeah. And to develop theories about how connectivity and connection have changed over the years. And how you can develop a co-presence with someone, even if you're not physically with them. Yeah, very interesting.
Also, I'm currently reading The Portrait of Winnie and Nelson Mandela's Marriage, a book it was written last year, but it's woven together by TRC, testimony, newspaper articles. So it's amazingly written because it's about their marriage and politics, but it's referenced, and all of the references are old newspaper articles or all their autobiographies.
Oh, that must have taken so much work.
I mean, a life. Yeah.
Together.
But yes, it is that kind of weaving together of historical artifacts.
And I think it is important to acknowledge professions that have done this
Yes.
for years.
Yes.
So that we're not, in a sense, reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
So to look at the historical stuff,
Yeah.
if you're going to do this kind of research, look at how historians have done it.
Yeah.
Because I think you can avoid a whole lot of pitfalls too.
Absolutely, yeah, sure.
So yes, the process involves creating autobiographical texts or texts, and then similar to thematic analysis, identifying themes, and then the lead researchers would braid together these themes and texts, preserving individual voices and illuminating the interconnections and differences into new narratives. And these new narratives, similar to duoethnography, might become articles for publication, but could also become life writing collections and reflections or essays, or here we see art-based inquiries and productions. So poetry at the next conference you present at, please, or interpretive dance. Okay. So just look at the methodological similarities and differences. The article highlights these. Here are some of the similarities. A site for collaborative inquiry. We see the self appearing, artifacts being used, this notion of autobiographical and self-writing. The text may include personal essays, memoirs, poetry, diaries. There's this, I was quite interested in the deepening of relationships between researchers. And again, this theme of a third space that arises between researchers and also ideas. And this is linked to this ethical space of engagement where those with disparate worldviews are poised to engage with each other. A juxtaposition of differences can create this third space. not just for you as the researchers, but hopefully for the reader to focus on moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural differences. So one of my biases is that what's the point of writing about yourself? But really it is about a social phenomenon. So yes, you're writing about yourself in relation to gender or race or curriculum or whatever it might be. And so there is still a message beyond exposing yourself. There are lots of differences identified in a table in the article, so I'll go through those briefly. The research approach for duoethnography is this collaborative dialogue, or a dialogue between two or more with distinct backgrounds, whereas the Métissage involves the blending of diverse cultural, disciplinary, and personal perspectives. In terms of voices, the juxtaposition of voices is important for duoethnography, whereas the braiding or weaving of the voices is important in Métissage. The focus, emphasis on dialogue and interaction, reflecting differences and commonalities for duoethnography, whereas for Métissage, the focus on synthesis and integration of multiple perspectives. The process, as we saw, involves co-writing and reflexivity for duoethnography, engaging in a dialogue to analyze and interpret shared and diverse experiences and insights, whereas with Métissage, there's a fluid and flexible approach, allowing for creative expression and experimentation and weaving diverse viewpoints and narrative approaches. Both lack structure, I think, but duoethnography causes some anxiety, and all of us actually. But the duoethnography, we see the script form appearing in articles, and Métissage is described mostly as iterative and interpretive, which I don't think is certainly not unique to that as a methodology. Duoethnography is intended to represent diverse perspectives, but as we saw, may not fully capture marginalized voices, whereas the aim of Métissage is to represent hybrid identities or cultural situatedness. Duoethnography, often used in cross-cultural contexts, and can be used as a decolonizing methodology, but not necessarily. Whereas in contrast, Métissage is intentionally decolonizing, intending to deconstruct colonial hierarchies. It celebrates hybridity and diversity. Power dynamics are acknowledged in duoethnography, whereas in Métissage there seems to be a more critical orientation where the power imbalances are challenged and needing to promote equitable collaboration. And the sharing of results, typically duoethnography, a co-authored text or dialogue, highlighting complexities, nuances, and insights gained, whereas Métissage can be in a wider variety of creative formats, including woven narratives, multimedia presentations. Actually, I'm thinking now, I haven't seen many, but some journals, you can have a video production of your abstract.
Yeah, medical humanities
Yes.
is one journal
Yeah.
that accepts alternative
Yeah.
approaches. Yeah, but then we were asked recently for a speech pathology journal to submit video abstract, and I said to Rowan, was it not that one? Well, there was some different format of abstracts that you were panicking about, and I said, let's ignore it.
Yeah.
Not much
No,
time
it's
in
now.
advance, we must do
Yes,
it.
no.
Yes, because I don't know what to do for it
No, you
either.
have to do an accompanying picture.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just put together a little illustration to suit it. And I
So-
think there's an AI that does that for you.
Yeah, so I said, let's just ignore until
I
now.
went to
Did you do one?
well, I did one, but it was pathetic. So I never sent it because I just went to, your free
Clip art.
Yes, exactly. And it looked exactly like I'd done that. Exactly. There's like figures of people reaching out with their hands. I'll send it to you for a laugh. I had about 20 of them because they were all the same.
But I guess it does then push you out of your comfort zone. So that Medical Humanities Journal also run a blog where they make the research more accessible.
Yeah.
So I remember we published an article and then they wanted a blog piece. It was a drama paper.
Oh,
And I worked with
reminds me of
Victoria.
blood sugars. Like,
Yes, totally.
all the time.
like I feel like this
Yeah.
methodology would have been.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what you were doing in
Yeah.
blood sugars is this essentially.
It was a very eclectic,
Yeah.
multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary project. It was very messy.
Yes.
And messy. And I think that's, yeah, I mean, that was the lesson we learned, was you need the reflection going into a project like that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there is research in the education field that if you can get kids to draw, it doesn't matter how it comes out, but if they can conceptualize the information that they're learning across all subjects in some kind of diagram form, they understand connection, they understand the content, they recall it better. So I'm really trying, even though I cannot draw myself, so my bias is to stay away from that. And it helps, especially the children that we end up working with the language impaired. And it's a very interesting thing. I think we are becoming very visual world.
Yeah, I have used this notion of the infographic as a task. So you ask students to read something and produce an infographic, and they can do it. Yes. Explain what you've just read, or even if you're trying to describe a normal distribution, how do you explain to a parent that your child falls one standard deviation below the norm? Put that in an infographic. So it's that kind of the use of a picture.
Sure.
I definitely feel like over the last couple of years as well, there's definitely been far more openness to looking at different disciplines, looking at different voices, not just from within the lay public and that, but within research as well. I feel like we definitely looking at other fields and disciplines in terms of informing our own research and practice. And I think that's been nice, whereas I think historically just be very siloed in terms of how practice is done within this area.
And there's only one way of doing it. Yes.
Yeah.
My only concern, and I think it probably comes to that word shattering, because I think there is a tendency to want to throw out the baby.
No, not it. Yeah.
And create something completely new. And then what happens is often that new thing needs to be tested over time, because the reason you can see what's wrong with the old system is because you've seen it over a number of years. Whereas you create something new that seems exciting but hasn't been tested. And I think that there's a little bit of a tendency to be quite dramatic, that this is all wrong and this is all right.
And how does it anchor into the past? Because there needs to be, or how does it relate to the past?
And
the
what
past
can
way of doing things?
And also that there must have been some merit for it to have survived as long as it did, and this is untested. So we've got to be a little. That was just my bias.
Sure. So much to think about.
Yeah. So just the last two parts about decolonizing research methodologies, and the author presents a 4 practices framework, which also I don't think is novel, but just to go through it, I think we all know that the dominant mode in academia is derived from Western canons, which is a system that's been created over the past 500 years, mostly theorizing of white male scientists in Europe, and this constitutes a very small proportion of world knowledge. Also, in preparing this, it made me think about key theorists in psychology like Jung and Freud and Rogers, whose work, I mean, I've known this, but it suddenly occurred to me that it's nothing more than veiled autobiographies, because their work is so heavily influenced by their time and who they were and their own personal issues, that they've just really produced autobiographies, but as accounts of other people. Or so their work is informed mostly by clinical work and work with patients, but so much of their histories is embedded in their work. So what's the difference between presenting who you are as research, veiled as traditional research, versus being explicit about the influences of yourself in your work?
I guess
Even
that's
being aware.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the challenge around autoethnographic studies, that I think we sometimes come across and see them as quite fluffy and autobiographical, and we you don't necessarily see and appreciate the rigor that goes into that kind of work if it's done properly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, in decolonizing research, I see you won an award recently at the SAI conference around your decolonial teaching. Yes,
Yeah. It's a paper Joanne and I wrote about how do we transform the profession using qualitative methods and including voices of patients and people who we are really trying to care for. So so it was nice to do that.
So yes, decolonizing research also about dismantling colonial foundations, and I imagine in the teaching space, how do we recognize student voice, unlearning colonial frameworks, and so this also is about a reverence for ancestral knowledge, and opening for voices not usually heard or heeded in scholarly conversations. And it may involve honoring oral tradition, land-based pedagogies, which are, as I said earlier, I think might be an important site for research around climate change and in my field, mental health, holistic worldviews and consultations with Indigenous people. Both methods privilege a relational view of the world. And an important quote, I think, by Wilson et al., that researchers, we are not separate from the process, but rather participate in the relationship with what we are learning, which I think is obvious, but also profound. If you're not in a relationship with what you're learning, you're not going to learn it.
And I think it really does come back to this notion of subjectivity, objectivity, which is so drilled into us from an early age that you have to do things objectively. And then along comes qualitative research and this kind of thinking, which is so deeply subjective. And that's okay.
I think in the sciences, most of my undergrad was in sciences, and we don't even really consider how, we aren't taught to think about how are we actually affecting the questions that we ask, how we are answering them, or what we're writing about. It's kind of almost taken as given. Which I think is a huge shortfall in teaching scientists.
And it's the knowledge sits outside you. Inside, it's not in you, it's outside that you need to engage with it. Yes.
Not just if you can measure it, if there's like a tool and it measures it, then
it's real.
Sure.
Yes. So we see that reference to locating authority and expertise inside rather than outside, and links to a postmodern philosophy that rejects the supposed distance and objectivity of a positivist or post-positivist researcher.
I think as well, because they don't. For me, it's not on like either end of the scale either. It's not like that it's completely objective or purely subjective, and that it's only you and that you are analyzing and having an opinion on the research. That there's this constant consideration of self and others, and kind of zooming in and out constantly throughout the research process, which I appreciated from these methods as well.
Can I just ask, in our sort of instant world, do you think people have the sophistication to understand that qualitative research is not not generalized? Or do you think they take one thing as gospel and then that can be the danger?
Well, I think there's still such issues with how qualitative research is perceived.
I mean, even this article writing about generalizability as a limitation, I don't understand why. Why would
assuming when it's written, it's called generalizing.
Right?
They have to be told explicitly. This is not generalized. It's not meant to be. But it's like that's the aim of so much of that kind of hard side, that especially quantitative science, that's the aim, is to make it as generalizable as possible.
Universal principle.
And is trying to marry like mixed methods as well, especially in the health sciences. Like they find it very hard to understand how the qualitative is different to the quantitative. I mean, I had someone asking me yesterday if they wanted to do mixed method, and then their supervisor and health sciences is saying, but for your qualitative part, like where's your what's your comparison group and what's your like, and then they're saying no, but it's, but it's exploratory, and they're like, no, but you have to compare it to something, and this is such a small sample size, you can't get any opinion from this, make any generalizations about this. And I was trying to tell the person who inquired about it, because they're at like the start of their PhD journey. I was like, but that's not the point.
When you spit like 5-day cricket versus, you know, and like the scientists want the T20. And they want to see that, they want to see who hits the 6, and they want to get a winner, like our. Now you've got the 5-day where you've got the nuance and the real skills and the, you know, the actual value of cricket. But nobody's got time. And I think that people get a bit frustrated. They get frustrated with us qualitative analysis, because they say like, well, you spent like 7 years. What's you know, like why? And you can't tell me anything that I can use. So like, what's the point?
Yes, and you're still going back to data that you collected 20 years ago. What's the point?
And I think that there is a responsibility in some sense. Is like, give us the, you know, what to do.
What can you do with it?
And how can we use this data? And I think how will the qualitative researchers are going to have to address that at some point. You know, there has to be some application. And if you can't apply a principle because it's not generalizable,
It's like what you were saying about the kind of auto ethnographies being a bit fluffy. It's like, because you might read it and you go kind of, okay, well, what do I do with this person's story about their own life, right? But I think if there are, or if it's written in a way that it like takes out insights that other people can use, like
compassionate.
But also to go like, oh, I also have this element in my background and it affects me this way, or I'm different to this person in this way, so I don't see it in that way. I think like if it's written in such a way that other researchers can use it for reflexivity, I think that's more helpful than just like, oh, this is the story of my life.
I mean, I think the story of everyone's life is useful in itself, but like the student that I'm supervising, she's reflecting on her experience as a Black woman in a white hospital space where the only other people around her, only other Black people around her were nurses, and how the other patients were white, and her experience of COVID. So I can see how people might read it and extrapolate, but many might be critical, like just self-indulgent reflection on your own illness.
But I think it's like, you know, like with a story like that, it depends on who you are. But I suppose like if you're like a white doctor in a hospital like that, to like reflect on, oh, this is this person's experience and how, what's my relationship with that? What do I respond? Like how is my behavior contributed to that in a similar situation, or like how do I reflect on what I need to do differently and think about it?
So I'm thinking, so I don't know if you've ever come across Rose Richards at Stellenbosch. So she did an autoethnographic PhD of her own experience of being a kidney transplant recipient. And she talks about this whole issue of transplant and chronic illness, and very, very powerfully done. She's done it very thoroughly. And really interesting to listen to. So there are people out there who are doing autoethnography well. But I actually think there's more power sometimes in the duoethnography and bringing in someone else's perspective. Sure.
It really like puts things against each other. Like, oh, this.
Well, that's what we experienced with that insider-outsider paper. Was we were able to sit and really interrogate and write up. So Ronan written quite personal stories of her experiences on a project, and then we did a lot of talking about it, shaped it into a paper where there were personal reflections on how we dealt with it and what we felt and how we navigated that scenario and what the lessons are going forward for other people.
That's probably my biggest reservation, is around the personal disclosure and my reluctance to do that.
Absolutely.
And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if that's because what we're taught. You know, don't show yourself. Don't show yourself.
shame as
Yes,
well.
yes.
Feeling embarrassed
Yes,
and ashamed.
yeah.
And, is this really worthy
Yes,
to be out
yes.
in an academic space?
Yes.
Or is it just my own stupid rambling?
But in retrospect,
Everybody else so much more together than me.
Yeah.
but everything I write obviously is influenced by my personal experiences, but maybe it's veiled in research. Obviously the stuff we research is influenced by our own interests and preferences.
It's deeply personal.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I was interested. So I see Nancy's on the call here as well. Nancy, I'd love to hear from you because essentially we've been doing, I guess, something akin to a duoethnography in terms of, so her project has been deeply reflective. But the conversations we've had as supervisors with Nancy around what's happening in her project and the kind of insights that are coming out. So it's a bit of an accidental.
Yes.
Yeah, Nancy, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Jenny. It's been very interesting listening to everyone this morning and just being a fly on the wall and hearing all the discussions. So thank you for including me from a online perspective. But that's why I read this article and was so interested, because I just thought, to be honest, I didn't realize or understand just how important reflexivity was, if that makes any sense. And then through the discussions that I had with you guys as supervisors, it helped to develop like my reflexivity and help me to see my own biases, which, because I've never done qualitative research before. So I've never had the opportunity to reflect as deeply as I had in this project. And like, I really liked the one quote in the article where he says, "Am I breaking up?"
No, I think it's just Bit's internet.
Okay, well, I'll put my camera off. You don't need to see me.
Yes.
But what
Yeah,
I
you were
was
saying you hadn't done qualitative research before, and you were reflecting on how important reflexivity was.
Yes, definitely. And then how that came through kind of, the messiness of my research. And I really loved the one quote from Wilson in the article where they spoke about, you haven't done research right as if it hasn't changed you. And I mean, again, like that was it's an obvious statement, but it's also so profound. And I was just like, wow, that's what's also so amazing about research for us as researchers. We get to be profoundly changed by what we research. And I think that's where duoethnography can be really amazing, because it also gives us that space to explore it and share that with other people, because I think that maybe also might help bolster when people are querying how reliable or trustworthy or whatever you want to use qualitative research is. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, but definitely, if I think of the journeys that we've been in recently around curriculum, it's been your project, Nancy, and it's been what Rona and I've been doing on that insider-outsider. And so definitely we've been doing duoethnography and didn't realize it.
Definitely.
But, I think, Nancy, this might be another thing to add to the PhD, but it would be nice to actually comment somewhere in the discussion around the kind of post hoc realization that this is what we've been doing, and the value of the deep reflective work that's gone into your PhD in terms of your own reflection, but also the reflections with supervisors and the epiphanies we've had about the students and the learning styles, etc. And what are we actually doing, and what works, what doesn't, and where should we be going? Yeah.
Definitely. And it's almost like when I wrote up, I think in one of the sessions that we had, with the Shut Up and Write, I kind of wrote a whole, it was quite long, on just kind of those epiphanies. So then this is a nice way to frame that as well, and to bring in the methodology of duoethnography.
Yes, and maybe talk about it as post hoc. This was not something we realized we were doing, but it actually is what we were doing. Yeah.
Yep.
Very profound.
Yeah. I suppose that is the skill in academic work, is to be able to name something that people inherently recognize. So I don't think duoethnography is new, but maybe what we're recognizing is something that we know already and now have a name to add to.
That on the paper. Somewhere they say that these methodologies haven't always been taken up in research because there is very little publication on it, and people don't necessarily have like
Research.
they don't have the references or the literature to always fall back on in the words for it. So it's interesting that they say that.
But I think also you, and maybe this is a bit of a dangerous statement to make, but I would say that perhaps engaging in this kind of research requires a bit of experience.
Yes.
And to get to a point where you're actually able to do that kind of reflection. So, you know, when you're a novice researcher, it's tricky. But then Nancy's project has shown us otherwise, that actually you've been able to reflect very deeply, and this is your first qualitative project. But then I guess it comes back to a discussion I had in a community of practice with a whole lot of Australian speech therapists around this notion of reflexivity, and can you actually teach students to be reflexive, or is it something that is just ingrained in some people more than others? And that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, we were talking about how frustrating it is that you can sometimes have a student working on a deeply meaningful project and they just can't get to that reflexive point. And then others, like Nancy, you've been so deep in the reflection and able to do that very naturally. So yeah, it brings about a lot of questions as to who does the method suit and which type of researcher.
Nurture nature.
Absolutely, and looking at it being done well versus done superficially. There's so much we can talk about. So you had extra slides.
No, it was near the end. I was going to ask, could you see yourself doing it? But you're saying you have done it. You've done it actually. You just haven't called it that necessarily.
Joanne doing a paper, and we've submitted a subsequent paper based on data from a rural prac that we worked on years ago, and we'd scribbled some notes on the power of ethnography, forgotten about it, and she found this document the other day. She said it to me, she said, this is quite good, we should do something with it. And so we've done probably duoethnography and engaged in a back and forth about how that rural prac experience and trying to teach qualitative methods and teach students to be relevant had such a profound impact on us as educators. And it was quite tricky because we really had to scrabble back in our memories, and we'd made little notes like chicken incident. I don't know what that meant because we hadn't elaborated at the time. So there was a lot of scurrying back in the memories and then trying to piece together, but very profound work. So it's an exciting space. It's a vulnerable space as well. You were talking about the notion of sharing, and I know that was something that you'd grappled with in that paper about kind of sharing your own perspective and putting it down on paper. And do we pursue it as a publication? You know, is it? How is it going to be received? We still don't know. So we are hopeful, but I think it's incredibly powerful in terms of what it teaches. And the kinds of lessons that one can learn, and the things that one should implement at the start of a project rather than post. Sure. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, this has been such a deep discussion, and I was so excited to read this and think, but I've been doing this. Now I have a name for it.
Yes. Also, you were talking about messy. I thought we can coin Metissage. We can from Metissage to Metissage.
Don't use that at your pitch. For higher power.
No.
Absolutely. You know, so but the transformative nature, I think, is just so powerful, and for me, it really does align with the slow research approach, this slow productivity approach, of being careful and intentional about the kind of research that we're doing. So it's a big commitment, but it's an exciting space to be in.
The other article I was thinking about was actually on how to analyze texts and images. So I'll send that to Sonto. But it was very philosophical. I thought, no, I don't have the time to engage with this, but maybe Sonto can.
No, absolutely. It's been tricky because we started to do a bit of digging. I started looking and I couldn't really find much. There's a lot on body mapping, but again, not much on actually how do you analyze and what do you do.
Yeah.
And I guess it's more about the person telling the story of the
Yeah.
picture, and that's really
Yeah.
the analysis. Is the two together.
Yeah. But also our basic qualitative analysis principles are useful, like parts and whole, what's there and what's not there.
Yeah,
Those
I
are
think
like
absolutely.
foundational.
Yeah, analysis. Because I
Yeah.
also had texts or narratives that were accompanying the drawings.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still feel that I could have done more.
Yes.
If speaking to the level would be useful.
Okay.
Tina's student.
Yeah.
Just because I know she's sat for a long time with data and she hasn't been sure how to approach it. And I think only now she kind of, I don't know all the intricacies, but I was talking to Tina, she's saying that and it was kind of finally it's and she's found a way that's worked in terms of analyzing data.
Yeah, and I think that's why when I read the paper, I thought I'd struggle with this because I needed structure. Step number 1.
Yeah.
Step number 2, this is what you do.
It's not there.
I guess that's what reviewers do. Yeah, that's what reviewers do. You know, they when they interrogate your methods, you know, they really want to know these things. And I was just thinking about how, you know, maybe in your qualitative paper you use this method and that trustworthiness section. What do you say? You know, what do you say about transferability?
Yeah.
When these are just your personal curricula, you know. So yeah.
But I think if you've got that applied bent and you frame things with an applied focus, you're always thinking about what are the lessons. And the lessons might be for me, but they might well also be for other people, you know, and I think there is value in that.
Yes.
I was also thinking if you're looking for someone who actually does do autoethnography very well, Tanya Sakota in the film department is an expert. And she's written several books on her own journey of film memory. And she's a great person to have a chat with. Yeah, I know her through the ethics committee. So Tanya Sakota might be a good person just to chat to you about.
I'll send my student there. I'm not doing it yet. I'm not yet convinced.
Oh gosh. Yeah, no, sometimes we do see a lot of them coming through, especially from the arts for SOA, the arts department, the drama department. And it's often quite brave exploration, but difficult to pinpoint the methods and to say, well, what are you really doing here? And I think often people go into it without actually acknowledging the risks to themselves of starting to open Pandora's box and explore some of those issues as well. So,
I was wondering, like on that note, like do the people like who are part of like faculty, like the reviewers and ethics committees and that are, I mean, I don't think it's done, but surely the people on those committees and the people who are being asked to review have to be quite open-minded in terms of different methodologies and pitfalls and pros and cons and
absolutely, and that's why we've got an array of people with different expertise,
skill sets.
And so I've had lots of chats with Tanya, for example, around how do we accommodate that method in our ethics applications, and what do we do and how do we deal with it? Because now you're the participant, so you know, do you have to sign a complaint or no? You know, how do we? But then also we, as I say, we see a lot of applications where people are clearly getting into something very deep that they had not thought was risky for themselves, and how do you then help them to navigate that space?
And I'm also just wondering if we don't. You know, if you're doing research in that, if you don't work with the history department, because you know that's a very sort of academically well-established way of looking at stories and
absolutely, and this is where this kind of research has to be done in an interdisciplinary space. You have to create something new from history and arts and So thank you.
Thank you very
It's so exciting. I feel like we could just talk.
And just so much background to the actual article.
Yes.
A lot of research went into.
And thank you for digging out other papers and lots of hard work. So
Thanks at all.
we look forward to the next one.
Yeah.